Welcome to Collective Protest and Rebellion, a Black Study Intensive by the Center for African American Poetry and Poetics at the University of Pittsburgh. It's here where we consider the proposition that art and poetry and radical writing are revolutionary acts. For certain, it's when we practice in the creative mind that we access a reality unknown to us otherwise. Likewise, it's in the experience of visual art, music, dance, film, narrative, and poetry where our interior spaces are altered, allowing us to enter the world as more compassionate, empathetic beings. We borrow from Fred Moten's notion of study when he says, "We are committed to the idea that study is what you do with other people. It's walking, talking, working, dancing, suffering, some irreducible convergence of all three held under the name of speculative practice." We come together differently now. But so many of us were compelled to enter physical space after weeks of pandemic isolation after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Those protests are Black study. Black study is a deep engagement with others. It's stepping outside of your comfort zone with the kind of courage, as Cornel West says, that looks unflinchingly at catastrophic circumstances and realizes virtues like love and hope and faith. We need speculative practice in order to reach outside of the intolerable and intractable present toward the future we deserve. We are excited to be in community with you. Hi, everyone. I'm Dawn Lundy Martin. I'm the director for the Center for African American Poetry and Poetics here at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm a poet. I'm a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and I'm joined by Angie Cruz, the fabulous fiction writer, also Pitt professor. She's co-creator of these events, and we're just thrilled to welcome you to the kickoff.
Welcome to the kickoff event for the Black Study Intensive Collective Protest and Rebellion, featuring Emily Greenwood.
We are so excited you're joining us, and we hope you'll come to all of the events this week. Go to our website to register. It's www.caapp.pitt.edu. All of the events are free and open to the public, and it's our chance to really study together with community members and faculty and students across all campuses.
Professor Greenwood's talk today is titled Overthrowing Deadly Metaphors. She's taken a single Greek phrase that has a long and difficult entanglement in American racial slavery and that is still very much of our moment, and shows how various Black authors give us the tool to dismantle and subvert this phrase.
Emily Greenwood is a leading figure in intersecting fields, classics, and Black studies. Her current book project is Black Classicisms and the Expansion of the Classical Tradition. The discussion portion of this event will be moderated by Pitt's own Dan Kubis, who works in the public humanities, and he also has a really great podcast called Being Human that you should definitely check out. We want to thank everyone who's made this week possible, especially the Dietrich School, Arts and Sciences, and the Dietrich Foundation. You can find all of our co-sponsors on our website, and they're also featured here.
We are pleased to welcome Emily Greenwood and later Dan Kubis. Feel free to use the chat function to discuss as you listen. And if you want to ask a question, hit the Ask a Question button. The entire purpose of this is that we are studying together for this week. We are so glad you're here with us.
Thank you, and welcome, Emily Greenwood.
Hello, welcome to everybody who is joining us. For those of you on Eastern Standard Time, good afternoon. And to others joining us from other parts of the world and different time zones, good day and good night and good evening. I'd like to start by thanking the University of Pittsburgh Center for African American Poetry and Poetics and Humanities Center. And I'd very warmly like to thank Professor Dawn Lundy Martin and Professor Dan Kubis for the invitation to be part of this week's program. And thanks as well to Dawn and to Dan and to Stefan Triplett for the vision and all of the planning that has gone into this event and the events ahead. So why are we here? Why are we here today for the beginning of a week of programming dedicated to the theme of Black study and collective action and rebellion? We might think that we are here to witness and stand in solidarity with the communities and families of the victims of racial violence and of structural and systemic racism. We might think that we're here to bear witness to the roll call of African Americans killed by the police or by their neighbors in the name of law and order. But this act of witness is no more and no less than basic civility. We are also here under the auspices of the University of Pittsburgh and other university communities to which we belong. And we're here because, as universities, we have not been taking care. In the language of the scholar Fred Moten, from whom the vision of Black study for this week is taken, as scholars who work in universities, we have been negligent. We've been negligent not just in disregard for the findings and insights of Black study and their significance for our societies and for our world, but we've also been negligent in not reflecting critically on the knowledge for which we're professionally responsible and how it is part of the problem that we're witnessing and lamenting. Within our universities, we have so many ways to document, to account for, and to critique forms of historical oppression and injustice, including the effects of race and racism. But we have relatively little appetite to ask how this affects what we do, how we teach, and indeed the entire structure of the university. One of the fundamental challenges that Fred Moten poses to us is to examine the reciprocal implication of the knowledges of the university and Black life. This is a challenge about knowing ourselves and knowing how deeply dehumanizing knowledge, by which I mean ideas that selectively apportion humanity to some groups but not to others, how this is woven into what and how we study. So with this in mind, and in the spirit of collective action, in my talk today, I take a text from my core academic discipline of classics, which is the discipline that refers to the study of the history, cultures, and society of ancient Greece and Rome, and I submit it to Black study. There are two parts to this talk. In the first part, I read a passage of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, in which a dehumanizing metaphor is substituted for rational argument, and I consider the difference that Black study makes to our interpretation of this passage. In the second part of my talk, I show what is at stake in reading this passage of Aristotle by tracing its reverberations in our America. This inquiry is part of a larger interest in philology, by which I mean the critical study of language and the production of meaning through language. In thinking about philology and the curriculum of the modern university, I've been influenced by a simple, stirring remark in Sheldon Pollock's article published in 2009, which has the title, "Future Philology, the Fate of a Soft Science in a Hard World." Sheldon Pollock, who is a professor of South Asian Studies at Columbia University, is an expert on the classical Indian language of Sanskrit, and he's written about the threats to the survival of classical philologies and what will be lost if we lose these forms of knowledge. Summarizing the scale of the threat, Sheldon Pollock argues, and I quote, "We are talking about the survival of the very capacity of human beings to read their past and indeed their presence, and thus to preserve a measure of their humanity." I take Sheldon Pollock's point to be that philology is not merely instrumental to understanding human histories, or works, or arts, and religions, and philosophies. Instead, philology is the study of how language makes us human. If we stop studying language critically and wakefully, then we lose sight of attempts to unhuman individuals and groups. In Book 1, Chapter 4 of Aristotle's Politics, embedded in an argument about the position of the slave in a theoretical account of natural hierarchies of rule in political communities. Aristotle refers to the slave as a sort of animate piece of property. This is the translation of CDC Reeve. In Aristotle's Greek, the phrase is kai hodoulos ktema ti emsichon. I'm going to read the passage of Aristotle Politics, Book 1, Chapter 4, in full. Aristotle writes, "Since property is part of the household, the craft of property acquisition is also a part of household management, for we can neither live nor live well without the necessities. So, just as the specialized crafts must have their proper instruments if they're going to perform their functions, the same applies to a household manager. Of instruments, however, some are inanimate and some are animate. For example, for the ship's captain, a rudder is an inanimate instrument, whereas his lookout is an animate one. For in the crafts, an assistant belongs in the kind or the category that consists of instruments. So too, a piece of property is an instrument for living, and property in general is a number of such instruments. A slave is a sort of animate piece of property, and all assistants are like instruments for using instruments." This passage belongs to a section in which Aristotle is discussing the rule of masters over slaves, which he justifies with his notorious theory of natural slavery. And this is Aristotle's idea that there are some human beings whose natures fit them or predestine them for slavery. In the pre-circulated paper, I review scholarly debates about why Aristotle wrote this sentence and how it fits into his ethical and his natural philosophy. But here, I'm interested in how Aristotle wrote this and what work language does. I'm going to focus on a few small words in Aristotle's Greek that help to misconstrue the humanity of the enslaved. Taking my cue from Toni Morrison's project of freeing up language, and I quote Morrison here, freeing up language from its sometimes sinister, frequently lazy, almost always predictable employment of racially informed and determined chains. I want to retrace Aristotle's language as he represents a category of person who is fitted for slavery by nature. The philosopher Malcolm Schofield has observed that, and I quote, "Aristotle's views on slavery are an embarrassment to those who hold his philosophy in high regard." Charles Kahn concurs and says, "We're dealing with the most embarrassing stretch of argument in the whole corpus of Aristotle." The historian Paul Cartledge has described it as, and I quote, "one of the most extraordinary and I think deeply regrettable episodes in the history of Western thought." In his survey of ideas of slavery in classical antiquity, Peter Garnsey has described it memorably and poetically as a shipwreck of a theory. As Malcolm Schofield summarizes this tradition of scholarly unease, the collective embarrassment stems from the fact that Aristotle is gratuitously expressing an unargued attitude towards contemporary slavery, which is promulgating, in the tradition of ideologies, the interests of a dominant class. In the philosophical literature, the attitude towards this section of the politics might be characterized as semi-apologetic. In recent decades, philosophers have been unanimous in condemning the presence of racist ideology in Aristotle's text, where the racism in question is a prejudice against ethnic groups who Aristotle characterizes as barbarians. But philosophers have also been fairly united in trying to restore credibility to Aristotle's philosophical argument when it's interpreted in the context of Aristotle's wider philosophy. Conversely, scholars of history have been far less patient with debates about the internal coherence of Aristotle's arguments and have pointed out obvious and painful continuities between Aristotle's conception of the natural slave and contemporary attitudes to slavery and mastery in Greek society. Among philosophers who've waded into this debate, Bernard Williams stands out in objecting that while Aristotle's arguments about slavery is continuous with his wider philosophy, this in itself raises uncomfortable questions for us about Aristotle's view of the world. So in asking not why Aristotle thought this, not how it fits into his philosophy, but how he wrote it, I echo Toni Morrison. In the essay Unspeakable Things Unspoken, the Afro-American Presence in American Literature, Toni Morrison explained that when she was a young woman, she was less interested in the absence of African Americans in what passed as canonical American literature. And she remarked, I quote, "It's not a particularly interesting question anyway. The spectacularly interesting question is, what intellectual feats had to be performed by the author or his critic to erase me from a society seething with my presence? And what effect has that erasure had on the performance of the work?" This takes us back to Fred Merton's challenge to us to know ourselves and not to estrange or consider Black study as a discrete and sealed off discipline, but the ways in which it has implications for everything that we do in the American university. So following Morrison, what interests me is the question of how Aristotle sat down and wrote that sentence, and the steps involved in the philological process of imagining and rendering a fellow human being, a thing, or a piece of property in Aristotle's Greek. Aristotle's theorization of natural slavery is slapdash and cobbled together. It relies on a loose style of argumentation in which explanatory conjunctions and particles do heavy argumentative work, tying together ideological fictions. In Greek, these are small words like hoti, translated as to the fact that, men, on the one hand, menun, so then, or tuinun, therefore, accordingly. Take the statement that Aristotle makes at Politics, Book 1, Chapter 5, where he writes, "It is evident, therefore, hoti men tuinun, that by nature some people are free and others are slaves, for whom slavery is both advantageous and just." The scholar Revel Netz has argued that in typical Aristotelian paragraphs, conjunctive clauses tie together a series of backward-looking claims that proceed from a thesis stated at the top of the paragraph. He explains, and I quote, "We realize, as it were, that the conclusion came first and that the argument is simply the best he could find and would not necessarily be an argument that he would have considered as perfectly convincing himself." When it comes to Aristotle's claim that the slave is a sort of animate piece of property, there are two grammatical features of Aristotle's language that stand out to me. First, his use of metaphor to construe a human being, a human subject, as a piece of property. And second, his use of the indefinite pronoun in Greek, te, a sort of, to concede that this piece of property is nonetheless animate, empsikos in Greek, ensouled. Many English translations of this passage of Aristotle skip the little particle which shows us Aristotle wrestling with meaning. For example, Benjamin Jowett's translation of Aristotle, published in 1885, simply translates this as "a slave is a living possession." He's omitted this indefinite pronoun, a sort of or a kind of, which in the Greek connotes vagueness and indicates the oddity of what Aristotle is claiming. After all, we should ask, how can a person be a thing? How can it be an object? And how can a thing or an object possess a soul? The vague little pronoun ti, a sort of, is an attempt to patch over this oddity in Aristotle's writing, because his logic cannot completely ignore the difference between human life and inanimate objects. Aristotle vacillates and relies on vague particles and the figurative ensemble of metaphors and similes. So he has similar claims about the slave in two other works, the Nicomachean Ethics and the Eudemian Ethics, where he uses similes and metaphors. A slave is, as it were, or a slave is a kind of insouled tool, he says there. We see here in Aristotle's Greek language being used to normalize and naturalize that which is not natural and normal. Aristotle's Politics is a text that circulates predominantly in translation. It's read widely in departments and programs of political thought, political science, political theory, and in classical civilization courses in our universities. In other words, it's a strong canonical text that supplies arguments and pretexts about politics as a rational sphere, and we could say that it continues to have normative force in many areas of political thought. If we overlook that little word, tir, that indefinite pronoun in Aristotle's Greek, then we ignore the sort of counter-human unnaturalness of the thought. And we ignore the fact that this is another micro-incident in a sorry history of the promotion of a divided social contract, which has fostered the liberal humanism of some human beings at the expense of others rendered infrahuman. The philosopher Charles Mills has dubbed this phenomenon the racial contract. My worry is not realistically that contemporary readers of Aristotle are in danger of endorsing Aristotle's theory of natural slavery, although at different points in modern history, not too distant from us, communities of readers have endorsed Aristotle's theory, leading the scholar Sarah Monison to dub it a pernicious theory for its historical effects. My worry is more that inexact attention to language and inexact translation fails to convey to readers how fuzzy and awkward Aristotle's argumentative process is here. We should be asking not just about the philosophical argument and its place in Aristotle's larger philosophical system, but the ethical choices that Aristotle has made at the level of language and how ideological fictions are smuggled in as philosophical argument, just as we should be asking and scrutinizing of our politicians and public leaders the ethical choices that they make in their use of language. To underscore the significance of poetics in Aristotle's theory of slavery, I turn to the poet and scholar Anne Carson, who has this lovely, counterintuitive evocation of Aristotle to provide philosophical backbone for what Carson describes as the true mistakes of metaphor, the ability of fiction to make false connections that jolt the mind into new realizations. Carson evokes a passage from Aristotle's Rhetoric in her poem, Essay on What I Think About Most, published in the collection Men in the Off Hours, which is from 2000. I'll read some stanzas from Carson's poem. Lots of people, including Aristotle, think error an interesting and valuable mental event. In his discussion of metaphor in the Rhetoric, Aristotle says there are three kinds of words: strange, ordinary, and metaphorical. Strange words simply puzzle us. Ordinary words convey what we know already. It is from metaphor that we get hold of something new and fresh. In what does the freshness of metaphor consist? Aristotle says that metaphor causes the mind to experience itself in the act of making a mistake. And at this moment, according to Aristotle, the mind turns to itself and says, "How true, and yet I mistook it." From the true mistakes of metaphor, a lesson can be learned. So here Carson is alluding to Aristotle's discussion in two works, the Poetics and the Rhetoric, where he describes metaphor as depending on an innate ability to see likenesses. So in the Rhetoric, Aristotle says, metaphors must be drawn from things that are related to the original thing, and yet not obviously so related, just as in philosophy, an acute mind will perceive resemblances even in things apart. Anne Carson cunningly recruits Aristotle as a spokesperson for the truth of fictional thinking. And in the same vein, I'm pointing to Aristotle on Deadly Metaphors, not to praise him, but to point out how his theory of metaphor authorizes error in his description of the slave as a kind of animated object. In the Politics, rather than using the paradoxical relations of metaphor to shock the mind into insight and clarity, the metaphor is used to smuggle in the error of mistaking a human being for a piece of property. As Margot Kondratieva has written, commenting on the uses of paradoxes and metaphors in mathematical argumentation, and I quote, "A paradox in the broad sense is a suddenly emerged unexpectedness, a statement or situation that looks unbelievable, wrong, or contradictory. The metaphor, as described by Aristotle, presents a paradox at the initial moment of establishing non-obvious relations." So we're familiar in the history of our country with the potent ideological work that these non-obvious ideological relations and metaphorical relations have performed in the service of a dominant slave-owning society. Take the beginning of the life of John Thompson, a fugitive slave, published in 1856, where the metaphor lurks with ironic force, and I quote, "I was born in Maryland in 1812 and was slave to a Mrs. Wagger. She had 4 sons and 2 daughters. The sons were all farmers, owning large tracts of land, which were well stocked with slaves and other animal property." Or take a more familiar passage from chapter 23 of Frederick Douglass's second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, published in the year 1855. There, Frederick Douglass recalls, "Among the first duties assigned to me on entering the ranks," this is when he's part of the circuit, the abolitionist circuit of speaking against slavery. "One of my first duties was to travel in company with Mr. George Foster to secure subscribers to the Anti-Slavery Standard and the Liberator. With him, I traveled and lectured through the eastern counties of Massachusetts. Much interest was awakened, large meetings assembled. Many came, no doubt, from curiosity to hear what a Negro could say in his own cause. I was generally introduced as a chattel, a thing, a piece of Southern property, the chairman reassuring the audience that it could speak. Fugitive slaves at that time were not so plentiful as now, and as a fugitive slave lecturer, I had the advantage of being a brand new fact, the first one out." Scholars of Aristotle's views on slavery and the politics rightly caution against the assimilation of Aristotle's ideas to debates about modern racialized conceptions of slavery. This is important. It's definitely the case that Aristotle does not operate with a racial conception of slavery that corresponds to modern theories of race. But he does rely on what we call racial formations. And he definitely racializes the concept of the natural slave, endorsing the idea that an entire group of peoples referred to derogatively as barbarians, barbaroi in Greek, are assimilated to the category of slaves by nature. So, for example, Aristotle writes, "Among barbarians, however, a woman and a slave occupy the same position. The cause of this is that they have no element that is by nature a ruler, but rather their community is that of male and female slave." This category, barbarians, does map, albeit indirectly, onto modern racism. And as Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, has pointed out, the category of barbarian is a fundamentally relative term and depends entirely on the subjective ethnicity of the writer or the speaker. So Aristotle's ready use of a chauvinistic binary theory that contrasts Greeks and barbarians shares kinship with the use of binary polarization in modern racial theories. And there's plenty of environmental determinism in Aristotle's work that was the kind that gave grist to modern racial theories. This is a topic that the scholar Denise McCoskey has explained very well in her book, Race, Antiquity and Its Legacy. Although in ancient Greek writers like Aristotle, we're not dealing with the modern language of race and racial formation. We're dealing, in the words of Denise McCoskey, with a particular set of processes that have traditionally and historically been associated with race including those rooted in essentialist thought, the belief that an identity is inherited and unchanging, and linked specifically to the body or the natural environment. Aristotle's conception of the slave as a living tool has facilitated the ideological branding of enslaved human beings as objects. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke back to this anti-human trope in Aristotle in a lecture entitled The Ethical Demands for Integration, which he delivered at a church conference in Nashville, Tennessee on the 27th of December, 1962. In that speech, King said, "The tragedy of segregation is that it treats men as means rather than ends, and thereby reduces them to things rather than persons. But man is not a thing. He must be dealt with not as an animated tool, but as a person sacred in himself." King alludes to and quotes Aristotle's idea of the slave as an animated tool, I think, because of the eagerness with which some Southern professors had embraced Aristotle's theories of slavery in the period leading up to the American Civil War, where they'd used Aristotle in the context of arguing for slavery as a positive good. As the scholar Chad Vanderford discussed in his article Pro-Slavery Professors, Classic Natural Right and the Positive Good Argument in Antebellum Virginia, there were a group of academics associated with the University of Virginia in the 1850s who espoused Aristotle's ideas about natural slavery under the auspices of classical natural rights. Those professors were influenced in turn by Thomas Dew of the College of William and Mary, who began to promulgate Aristotle's theory of natural slavery as an expedient text for pro-slavery exponents already in the 1830s. The successful dissemination of these ideas in the period leading up to the American Civil War is illustrated in an article by William Grayson of South Carolina, published in 1860. And I'll quote from this. If we're thinking about the university and the history of the university and its approach to Black study, this is a sad and painful quotation. Grayson wrote, "A democracy, therefore, must consist of free men and slaves. This is the substance of the dogma. It is not a new thing, but it's 2,000 years old. So far from being first enumerated by Mr. Calhoun, it is as ancient as Aristotle. In his Politics, which should be a textbook in all Southern colleges, in words as clear and emphatic as language can furnish, Aristotle lays down the maxim that a complete household or community is one composed of free men and slaves. He maintains also that the slaves should be barbarians, not Greeks, as Mr. Calhoun now holds it to be an advantage that the slaves of the South are Negroes, a barbarian race sufficiently strong and docile for labor." Aristotle's theory of natural slavery was conducive then to arguments of slavery as a positive good for an enfranchised citizen class. And as we see in Martin Luther King's invocation of this deadly idea, its malign influence persisted after emancipation in the racist objection of Black Americans in the era of Jim Crow and beyond. The Memphis sanitation workers who went on strike in Memphis between February and April 1968 are preserved in visual memory by the iconic photos taken by Ernest Withers, including the photos depicting the strikers bearing placards with the slogan, "I am a man." The slogan is attributed to Bill Lucy, but the tenet it expresses is integral to the civil rights movement. In a speech that the Reverend James Lawson delivered to the striking workers on February the 24th, 1968, he preached, "For at the heart of racism is the idea that a man is not a man, that a person is not a person. You are human beings, you are men, you deserve dignity." Reverend Lawson's statement has a rich and complex genealogy. He attributed it himself to a tradition in Black thought going back to African-American spirituals, but he may also have been thinking of the motto for the Committee of the Abolition of the Slave Trade, founded in 1787, which popularized the abolitionist appeal, "Am I not a man and a brother?" This motto was made famous by cameos designed and mass-produced by Josiah Wedgwood, who himself became a member of the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. Aristotle's racist dismissal of the human intelligence of predominantly barbarian slaves was all too easily pressed into racist ideologies by subsequent ages. The classical idea of the exclusive political community, with Aristotle as its spokesperson, continues to sow legacies of political exclusion, in which citizens are disenfranchised of the vote, and in which members of our political community are not seen and not counted, and are killed with apparent impunity because of the compact between political citizenship and a selective conception of who corresponds to our society's vision of a full human being. So to conclude, in the pre-circulated paper, I ended with Hortense Spiller's classic 1987 essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American grammar book, in which Spillers famously analyzes the business of what she calls dehumanized naming in American legal codes, literature, and thought. In a really astute reading, Spiller used philological argument to lay bare the crooked grammatical logic of the dehumanization of the enslaved. Today, I'm going to end with Christina Sharp, a scholar committed to the practice and study of radical Black philology, who writes in the tradition of Spillers, as well as in the broader poetic tradition of the innovative use of language as a tool for representation and critique, exemplified by poets like Dionne Brand and Harriet Mullen, from whom we'll be hearing this evening. In Christina Sharp's book, In the Wake, published in 2016, she offers an account of the condition of Blackness in contemporary America and proposes the concept of the orthography of the wake to denote the coercive linguistic environment that has shaped Black being from subjecthood to citizenship. And she describes this phenomenon resulting in a kind of dysgraphia, which, Sharp says, and I quote, is the inability of language to cohere around the bodies and the suffering of those Black people who live and die in the wake and whose everyday acts insist Black life into the wake. For Sharp, the opposite of this dysgraphia is the project of writing back to and disrupting received meanings, and the project of using grammar as a consummate tool of linguistic subversion and rebellion. I suggest then that deadly metaphors and Aristotle's particular use of a deadly metaphor is a part of this project. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Emily. Yeah, that was incredibly moving. It's so I feel like I should be clapping by myself because that would normally happen. I have a few questions for you about that really wonderful talk, and I think I'll try to have a few questions for you until 2, at which point we have some Q&A questions from the audience in the chat, and we'll ask them also. And I want to just thank the sponsors for today too for having me be a part. This is just really a wonderful opportunity for me to be able to talk with you and be part of this event. It's really an honor. So thanks to all of today's sponsors from me also. I don't know. So I have a few questions about, where to start? About your talk. And maybe I could begin by asking something that comes from the language of, it's about your orientation towards philological work. And in the comments that you just made, you were connecting your work with Toni Morrison and talking about that the important question for you to ask of Aristotle is not why he wrote this, but how, and that question orients your work it has implications for everything in the university, and it keeps us from kind of cordoning off Black study from everything else. And that seems like such an important chain from why to how. It seems so important not only for your work, but also for the potential of our orientation to language in general. So I thought I would begin just by inviting you, if you wish, to say a little bit more about that and why that's so important for you and your work, and the implications for that, the how instead of why.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. Yeah, I mean, I think I would draw a connection here, perhaps, with the avoidance or hesitancy of talking about race in relation to classical antiquity or the sort of ancient pre-modern world. And I think there so much arguments hinge on language and the absence of language. And I see that as part of the larger phenomenon of our readiness to absent ourselves from the responsibility of race. It's not the case that we read Aristotle in a vacuum. It's not the case that Aristotle has come down to us unmediated. We make and remake Aristotle in our scholarship, and we make and remake Aristotle every time we teach him. And I think the reticence or the sort of unseeing, which thinks, hang on, what have we just read there? What we just read in this ancient philosopher, where he's used this metaphor to describe a slave as a kind of or a sort of animate piece of property. In the modern classroom in America, and I mean modern in a loose, expansive historical sense, how can you not comment on that and connect that to legacies of race? Which are woven into our disciplines in the modern university. So I think that question of how is it that we go about the business of our study and our teaching, and what do we think we're discussing? It is too easy to isolate or cordon off and say this is Greek philosophy. It's only to be read within a particular disciplinary tradition, or that's a study that belongs over there. We need to break down those distinctions.
Yeah, well, that reminds me of another question I was going to ask, which is that, you mentioned in your comments that the politics, the text you were drawing, or you were focusing on most directly, is typically read in the context of political science, political theory, and in those maybe great books in that context. You're putting it in a different context. In what you've just talked about, there's 20th and 21st century African-American literature, poetry, novels, that kind of thinking. One of the questions I had for you was what does that context make visible in Aristotle's work that reading it in the context that it's traditionally read in kind of obscures?
That's a good question. I suppose in any sort of academic discipline, when you're dealing with a big text like Aristotle's Politics, which is a lot to read through, even in English, let alone in Greek, there's a tradition of excerption. You study particular passages, you set particular books, and you might never come in the context of a classics class to thinking more generally about comparative political theory or political science. Whereas that is, a ready-made context for discussion in political thought or political science. But I suppose I'm interested that although we have these separate disciplinary traditions, you have these authoritative translations that are floating and moving in between them and importing meaning. So, even before we get to the work of a discipline, a translation is a sort of a Trojan horse with hidden pockets of meaning that do sometimes make things brilliantly apparent and open up a text critically, but at other times suppress comment on things which are actually quite strange in the source language. Right.
And then the university also seems to play a role there too, like the university departments and political science departments, and this draws our attention to the way, this is more of a comment than a question for you, but the way that universities are implicated in the longer histories that you're talking about here.
Yeah. So, for me, it's unavoidable and painful. We had, as many people know, at Yale, a residential student college named after John Calhoun, and that name was changed in 2017 after sort of quite a public process of wrangling and agonizing over historical naming, and to read those passages. Calhoun wasn't so explicitly interested in Aristotle, but to read those passages in which Aristotle and Calhoun are part of a sort of almost a panel of authorities that you can go to if you want to authorize pro-slavery debates. And we have barely begun the work of reckoning across our universities to take account of how this is part of our history at different stages in the university, and how elements or echoes of reverberations of those ideas still haunt and stalk our campuses.
Yeah, I mean, the same definitely holds true of the University of Pittsburgh, that they're our host today. And I guess one question that I would have for you is, are there particular, you've just given us in your comments here today such a great example of how we can be aware of the histories of language and the power arrangements that they're a part of. Are there ways that you, as a teacher, work on this with your students in classrooms and try to get them to be aware of they're also, of course, part of the university as well? And are there particular ways that you think about doing that as a teacher?
Yeah, so I mean, stepping outside of the box, and sometimes some of the most vital and challenging examples are not examples that are part of our curriculum, our given curriculum in a discipline. This evening, we're going to hear a fabulous example from Harriet Mullen's collection, Sleeping with the Dictionary, which is, the praxis of lexicography, of tearing up the science of discipline dictionaries and reconstituting them in contemporary poetry. So, just taking time, an outtake in a class to say, I'm not going to call on you to ask you for a definition of this word in Greek. Instead, I want you to tell me what you found when you looked in the dictionary. How does the dictionary strike you? Are these meanings sufficient? What is the dictionary for? How do you use dictionaries? What do they do for us? Just to, I think, stop and question everything, because we talk in educational theory about the hidden curriculum as a source of exclusion in our universities. But the hidden curriculum is also things that are hidden to us that we don't make explicit, and thinking, we're just taking for granted so many knowledge operations.
Yeah. Well, that idea of, I think, reconstituting, you mentioned in connection with some of the poetry of reconstituting language, reminds me of one thing I wanted to ask you about Aristotle, which is that the comments that we heard from you now strike me as being more kind of deconstructing or kind of opening back up, let's say, something that had been closed off in Aristotle, and that is reading that ambiguity back into the line about a slave from the Politics, right? And that you show us so well how that had been closed off and used by people in, for example, proponents of American slavery in certain ways, and that wouldn't have served their ends very well. What I was wondering whether or not so after we take that apart in Aristotle and show that it's more complicated than it may seem, are there also resources in Aristotle or in other classical texts for doing the work of reconstituting something different that you can point us to, or that you work with in your text? I know you've translated Thucydides and done so much work with other classical authors. Are there other places that you think of when you think of the possibilities of reconstituting that, doing that work?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think, we bear responsibility for classicizing authors and for canonizing them. And as part of that process, we sometimes impose a sort of a unity or perfection on them that is not there. So I think, one definite place that you can start, and I was trying to do this a bit in my talk, is to read Aristotle and different works and passages against himself, and to say, Aristotle gives us quite good tools for seeing what he's doing here with this metaphor and how strange this is. So, I'm not talking or imagining jettisoning Aristotle for an instant, but, taking him down off his pedestal and thinking laterally about, how do we make this idea of Aristotle and his genius, and, how can we read holistically and critically and give Aristotle, due scrutiny?
Yeah, we had, I guess maybe I could think about, I'm kind of like looking at the questions that are coming up in chat here too, and I see someone here, I'll kind of like, this seems like a good kind of follow-up to this question I'm asking you, which is, do you have more insight about how deeply these thoughts ran in the writings of Aristotle? This is something I have never heard about. Right? So that's the question. And to me, that seems like it's asking about kind of like, is this how, so yeah, you're not imagining jettisoning Aristotle. So in what way, what could we draw on now and look to Aristotle? Are there things that can be a positive part of the project of reworking the kind of politics that he talks about there?
Yeah, I think of, again, getting away from the idea of a classical tradition that's enclosed and thinking, it matters where we put Aristotle on a syllabus and what we put next to him. So, by juxtaposing Aristotle with Toni Morrison, by juxtaposing Aristotle with Christina Sharp, you immediately get a sort of a friction of ideas and a dialogue rather than just a sort of more passive attempt to sort of try and read meaning or sort of, in fact, extract the meaning from Aristotle, where it's assumed that this is a difficult text and you are barely worthy to comprehend it.
Right. Yeah. Well, maybe and this kind of like relates, I think, to maybe a bigger, this is kind of pulling back for a second and asking a bigger picture question about philology. You talked in your work about is the concept of radical philology and radical Black philology, or is it a kind of scholarly practice that you bring into conversation here? I wonder if I guess I would just invite you, if you could, for a second, to talk a little bit about that. And the context I have for this invitation is that I think for me anyway, most of the times when I read about philology, even no matter what people want to say about it, it comes with the admission that its reputation is being old-fashioned and being out of date and being musty and all of this other stuff. You've given us something so different, something where philological practice is brought into conversation with urgent political contemporary realities. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about the importance for you of making contact with those things. That is, this practice, this older scholarly tradition of philology and our urgent contemporary realities. Why is it important to make contact between those two things for you?
Great, thanks. Just to concretize and illustrate what you said, we point to the professional organization for classicists a few years ago changed its name from the American Philological Association, for the reasons you mentioned, to the Society for Classical Studies, to sound less esoteric, to it does on the tin, because philology has become something of a dry as dust word. And I'd say that, there is a general wave in the field. Many other scholars are working on this idea of radical philology, but perhaps we're not looking around at other disciplines. And, we have a tendency to sort of think that because philology in its inception in the modern university was in dialogue with classics and in dialogue with religious texts and exegesis, that we have a monopoly on it. Use the term again and again, radical Black philology, that there is incredibly exciting work being done on the sort of intersection or meeting between philology as knowledge practice and the social and justice and Black life and issues of race in contemporary society. And that has not traditionally been any part of the conception of philology in classics.
Yeah. Well, I have one more kind of a big picture question about philology. Is, for me, one of the places that I think of first when I think of philology is there's a chapter in one of Edward Said's books called The Return to Philology. And he's in that chapter recommending a kind of philology that actually offers the opportunity for resistance, much as I think you are doing. I think as I read it anyway, I think those things are kind of aligned. But one of the things that he also warns about in that chapter is moving too quickly from a text to what he calls mobilized collective selves. And he's thinking there, I think, of things like nations or religions or anything, and I don't mean to single those out at all, but like anything, any kind of collectivity that can define itself by exclusion, perhaps aggressively exclusive. And so I wonder, you know, with the theme of this week being collective protest and rebellion, I kind of wanted to offer all of this to you and see if you had some thoughts on collectivities, the kinds of collectivities that you feel like the work that you're doing, the poets that are important to you, the writers that are important to you, be it classical, contemporary, whoever they are, you know, what kinds of collectivities do you think they offer us the opportunity to bring into being? You know, how would you describe those collectivities?
Yeah, that's very helpful. You know, I think that, you know, in focusing on language, which is always interactional, you know, in any sort of speech act or use of language, we may think that we're describing objectively, we may think that we're speaking to the outside, but we're also speaking of ourselves in that moment. I mean, the choices, the ethical choices that we make in our language very much characterize and define us as well. And again, this is something that Dion Brand and Harriet Mullen bring out so well in their poetry. So, you know, I think that idea of a sort of reciprocal, mutually implicated linguistic community of language users that hopefully also is not just monolingual, but is post-monolingual, and that is alert to the different roots and different languages that exist in any one society, is a way of writing or thinking across more exclusive communities and collections of people. Yeah.
And that idea, you mentioned the idea of reciprocity earlier, thinking back also with regarding your connection with Fred Moten. So reciprocity and mutuality, are these some of the qualities that are important for you in the poetic works that you read also?
Yes, yeah, you know, absolutely. The sort of responsibility that we have for each other in any sort of meaning that we offer, in any work that we put out there, when we're sitting on our own and composing a work, composing a sentence, who are we addressing it to? Who are we imagining as the world of the text or our interpretative community? So I think this reciprocity and mutuality is fundamental to everything. And if we're forgetting that, then we're condemning ourselves to sort of speak to closed communities and within closed communities.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Emily, for that.
Thank you for your questions and comments.
Yeah. I have, we're just about up at 2. So maybe at this point we have some questions, some really good questions that the audience has sent in for you also. And I see one here that I can read. And I think what we'll do for people who are watching is I'll suggest one, but also I'll invite you, Emily, to kind of see if there are questions here that you would really like to speak to also. So maybe I can start with one here. Let me see. Yeah, this seems like a really interesting question to me. So the question is, can you speak a little to the difference between talking back as a response to dehumanized naming versus explaining yourself in reaction to dehumanization? So I see there the question is between talking back versus explaining yourself in reaction to dehumanization. Can you speak a little bit to the difference between those two?
Yeah, that's nice. That's quite subtle, but a very important part of the sort of transactional nature of whenever we are in encounters where we're raced, minoritized, dehumanized, or the target of sort of dehumanizing projections. The question is, you know, do you recognize, do you assent to that form of address, which is, I take it, what might be meant by explaining oneself, versus a more adversarial talking back. And this is something that Ray Chow, the scholar Ray Chow, has written about very well, the sort of way in which interpolation from Althusserien theory works in context of race, where if you respond to the slur word or the racial form of address, then, you know, you're complicit in a way with your ability to be named as such. And yet in those moments, the last thing, I feel, that I think many of us feel, is the sort of wherewithal to say,
Right.
I reject. I reject your use of that word. I reject your projection. I refuse to acknowledge that as a legitimate form of address. So, I mean, and yet talking back in order to have leverage, is often, for those who have the verbal acuity and wherewithal, a form of punning, a form of put down that takes an aspect of what's been said and subverts or twists it. So I see the two as deeply interconnected. But I think that's crucial, that there's a sort of critical point or a choice in those moments where we decide, what history is being evoked here, what identity is being projected on me, and how do I respond to it? That's why I think making ourselves ready through study, in which we rehearse these encounters, in which we know the deep and long history of how this has happened again and again, makes one feel less isolated and estranged in those moments.
Yeah, that idea of making ourselves ready is so important, it seems like. And that actually reminds me of one other question that I kind of wanted to ask you but couldn't fit anywhere, which is that there's an essay you wrote earlier this year on M. Norbesi Philip and Derek Walcott, and the way that the classics appear in their poetry. And one of the things that was really interesting that you write about their works and their use of the classics has to do with the fact that Greek and Latin, so they're reworking these texts, but also using Greek and Latin, the language, because even though those languages are languages of empire in various ways, they were not languages of empire in the Caribbean. And so there are some opportunities that are opened up to them by working through Latin. Is that connected to the thoughts you were just giving us about kind of like how you can, what language you can express oneself in?
Yeah. So even in a sort of monolinguistic continuum, the study of languages, the study of the history of languages and their usage alerts us to the fact that within the same language, there are all kinds of other linguistic roots. And again, I'd connect that to this idea of readiness and giving us options, the ability to defuse and deconstruct, or to sort of redirect uses of language that are harmful and hateful, by knowing them for what they are and being able to contest and challenge. Definitely.
Yeah. Great. Let me look to another question here from the audience, and I'll just kind of like read this out. So here it is. White supremacy and patriarchy starts in the antiquity of the classics. It does seem so long ago. Metaphor has also been used in the powerful writing of Afrofuturism and the sci-fi work of Octavia Butler. Can you discuss the differences between the two functions of metaphors and new uses of languages? There's a lot there.
Yeah. I don't think that metaphor fundamentally changes that much as a concept. I mean, within different languages, of course, the sort of ways in which metaphors are introduced or expressed shift. But I take your point to be the sort of gap between historical gulf and different worlds versus the sort of the fact that we are dealing with palimpsest, where ancient texts and ideas repeat themselves because they're mediated, reused, recycled, and repurposed by different users and readers in different contexts. And because our foundation in America, is so deeply invested in the classics, that provided a big charter for the use of classics and the circulation of classical texts in all kinds of ways. But I take your point that there are traditions that are somewhat less proximate to that classical tradition, that are helpful for breaking the circuit and giving us some distance and saying, look, it doesn't always have to be rooted in the classics. And there are ways of thinking about these topics that are, independent, if we can call it that. Yeah.
Yeah. there's another question here about, hang on one second. I want to here. Oh, so there's a request for you. Could you repeat Sharp's quote on the inability of language, right? And it's to cohere around Black bodies and the suffering. If I remember correctly about that.
I'll read it here.
That'd be great.
The inability of language, Sharp writes, this is her gloss on the term dysgraphia, the inability of language to cohere around the bodies and the suffering of those Black people who live and die in the wake and whose everyday acts insist Black life into the wake.
Yeah, and then the follow-up question to that is just why, can you say a little bit about why you see that quote as important today?
Yeah, there is so much there in Sharp's quote that I didn't really address. The whole concept of the wake, which is seminal for Sharp, for Fred Moten, and many other contemporary Black scholars and thinkers and artists, not just contemporary. I mean, the wake we're talking about is the sort of historical aftermath that is still present, still is a very important adverb here, still present after the sort of world of the transatlantic slave trade and the racial world that we have inherited. So I didn't talk so much about the concept of the wake, but I was particularly interested in dysgraphia. Literally in Greek, dysgraphia is sort of awkward, difficult writing, the sort of fumbling that I was describing with Aristotle, where he knows at a fundamental level that a person cannot be a piece of property. So he finds that awkward indefinite pronoun as a kind of, a sort of. And so that's where I was using Sharp's idea of dysgraphia directly, but then pointing to the fact that we see pronouns, we see parts of speech doing similar work in contemporary racial thinking and imagination.
Yeah. The other thing, I was happy to see this question because the other thing that's in Sharp's quote that I see as being a big part of your work and your interests and is the idea of bodies. And that it reminded me of a short article that you published earlier this year in the Yale Alumni magazine, I think it was, where you were talking about Yale's and institutions and universities' implications in the history that led to George Floyd's murder and responsibilities going forward. And in it, you have this quote from Elizabeth Alexander in an essay she wrote about after the Rodney King, so many years ago, but after the Rodney King video circulated. And the quote is about I'll just kind of read it really quickly, the history of white power narratives that attempt to talk Black people out of what their bodies know. And I really this is connected to the idea of for me, about the Black, Christina Sharp referencing Black bodies. And I just kind of wanted to ask you about your work and how you position your work and what you want for it in light of what Black bodies know.
Yeah, thank you. It's a sort of great question, and it's a great invocation of that very powerful quotation by Elizabeth Alexander. I think the problem is that not just one problem, a problem that we're wrestling with in our universities and in our public discourse is, the sort of messiness of how we talk about race, this debunked concept that has so much lethal force, deadly force, continuing deadly force in our societies. And for those who have bodies that are raced, so often one response, sometimes it's a good faith response of saying, don't talk about race. Race is a horrid concept. It's not a thing. You are not raced. And yet that takes away a set of language which, forms of language that have structured your whole life and existence involuntarily in a third person sense. Often the first encounters are as a child when you realize that you are not who you thought you are. Going back to W.E.B. Du Bois's idea of the veil, you realize that you are construed as a problem by some people in society and that a tradition follows you or is projected onto you. And so talking bodies out of what they know, I suppose, is at the junction point of that gap between language and debates about the history and philosophy and semiotics of race and what can and cannot be said, even when it's known. And so I suppose strategic essentialism is the way to say, yes, it's an essence. I'm going to talk about my Black body and the way that it is construed and treated by society. Because otherwise, that's just another gift to those who would like to avoid and deny the continuing operations of race.
Right. Yeah, thank you. I'll go kind of to the audience questions again really quickly here. Here's one that reads, or there's a kind of a few questions here. How does the way you think about the glorification of Aristotle change in the context of the internet and broad movements for social justice and independent education? Do you view the power of the university as substantially changing? And how does this potentially empower alternative readings of history?
Could you say that again? There was a lot.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot there. So the question is, how does the way you think about the glorification of Aristotle change in the context of the internet and broad movements for social justice and independent education? And do you view the power of the university as substantially changing? And then there's one more kind of addition to that. And how does this potentially empower alternative readings of history?
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't get that all at the front.
No, it's all right. There was a lot there.
So it's a good many-layered question. I draw an analogy with one of the potential uses that the internet can serve with a very strong tradition in this country of autodidacticism as a source that can contest received meanings, because people negotiate their own relationships with text outside of disciplinary traditions, normative traditions, which tell you how to think about a text in light of how other people in the past have thought about it. So I think definitely that the internet can have that function, and people can encounter Aristotle in different contexts and connect with his work in different ways, with the very important proviso that the internet, serves as communities who connect with Aristotle and other ancient Greek and Roman philosophers in their own ways, in pursuit of white supremacy, misogyny. I mean, Donna Zuckerberg has written about this. So yeah, it's mixed and difficult. But yeah, I mean, your question then about how does this change the authority or position of the university? I think universities need to be cognizant of different sources of knowledge and how they account for what are the current cultural frames of reference, because otherwise we'll just end up speaking past a very large sector of the population that we're supposedly meant to be in dialogue with and meant to serve.
Absolutely. Well, maybe this will be, we're coming up on 2:15, but we don't have a minute or two left. Maybe I'll look, there's one more question here that we can, it's big, but still, we'll try to get this in. So here, this question is, what do you think the effects of Aristotle's political ideology are on modern Western governments, such as in America, considering how much of his ideas are very much embedded in the creation of our society?
It's
big. Sorry.
Suitably big question.
Right.
I think there would be two different ways of answering that question. The one would be a very sort of archivist kind of way of trying to sort of document explicit citations of Aristotle in the organs of government. But, I think the translatability of Aristotle's text, and I'm talking specifically about Aristotle's Politics, is that, Aristotle and his team of researchers did all of this particular work on different constitutions. And the Politics rests on that idea of being able to generalize and extrapolate from the particular to offer a sort of universal sounding statement of how all political communities are. That's the mode and the voice in which the Politics is written. So it's hard often to sort of pinpoint that Aristotelian influence, which just assumes, looking back to Aristotle, that this is how a political community works. These are its component parts. These are the cycle of constitutions. So, that's another effect of the canon and why it's so important in universities that we provide historical and critical context to enable students, to enable ourselves to make connections and to
Right.
see allusions and echoes and what ideas are being smuggled in and what traditions are being evoked.
Yeah, thanks so much, Emily. And I'll just say, I think we're gonna have Dawn come back on in a moment, but let me just say that I really do think that like your work provides us with such a good model of how to do that. It's really been an honor to get to talk with you and read your work, pay attention to it, and get to talk with you at such length about it.
Thank you. As I hope I've sort of made very clear, my work is illuminated and informed and has learned from scholars who I've cited today and many others. So, I very much want to end by saying that we are part of an interrelated community, whatever discipline we're in, and we all need to learn from each other's insights.
Yeah, well, thanks so much.
Professor Emily Greenwood, thank you so much for a enlightening and brilliant and really moving talk. Thank you, Dan Kubis, for your adroit and sensitive moderation. Thank you to the Humanities Center for co-sponsoring this event. I want to say that, it's so appropriate for the beginning of this week. At this moment in history, we're having lots of conversations about how we got to this particular place in this country and around the world, where it seems that sometimes change is intractable, and that there are perceptions of the racialized body that we ask questions about. Why is it that the Black body is perceived, for instance, as a body that experiences no pain or, is reducible to a certain kind of object? And I think that I usually think in terms of the kind of threads of discourse that participate in this kind of continual meaning making and re-inscribing of the Black body. And I just found your talk to be, like I said before, not only illuminating, but reminding us of those parts of history in terms of political thought that either we don't know or sometimes forget, provide really cogent and material traces into the present. And I love the way that you talk about poetry, and we'll hear more about that tonight, as doing something different when it comes to language and meaning making. So thank you also to all of our sponsors, to our production team, and to the audience for coming to this event from around the world. Tonight, we will feature Harriet Mullen and Dion Brand, and Emily Greenwood will come back as a moderator for that conversation. That's at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Just a reminder, as we continue to face kind of onslaught of crises, to resist, to continue to create, and also thrive. So thank you, and good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye, thanks.
Bye.